So we are very pleased today to have the opportunity to present the award, the Botwinick Prize, to Michael Hershman for reasons which I will explain. But he has come here to receive a prize which is named after the Benjamin Botwinick, who had a Bachelor's of Science degree in 1926 from this University of Columbia, and his wife Bessie. And every year when we present this prize, we choose through a collective process which goes through many people and many eyes and many suggestions, a person who represents the values of this family and the importance of ethics in business. And we're very happy today, Michael, to have you with us. My little role in this is I'm in charge of the Sanford C. Bernstein Center for Leadership and Ethics. And we are the center which is responsible for many things, both from the research activities we do and also for the pedagogy at the school. The pedagogy for ethics at Columbia, ethics is debated at every university, and how to deliver this is divided up with the orientation. Actually, we have Professor Phillips here today, who was responsible for that in the core classes, and I think we've strengthened what we're doing in this area, and also in experiential learning, where students actually get trained in how to respond to ethical dilemmas. And one of the classes, macroeconomics classes in particular, teaches the importance of honesty and transparency in terms of economic growth. And I believe every faculty who ever teaches that puts up on the board the famous transparency ratings, as we all know. The center will have always has conferences going on. We will have a conference in a few weeks' time, actually in November. We call the big question of why my firm, my organization, and my university does not change very quickly. It's always been a puzzle in people's minds, where we bring in a bunch of people from Goldman Sachs, Verizon, IBM, and elsewhere to talk about these issues. And we have a very active board, Student Leadership and Ethics Board, who's managed to bring in every single Secretary of Treasury. I don't know how they do this. They bring in people who already have their signatures on money. You can't bribe those people who are when they sign the stuff themselves. But they've managed to do that, with the exception of Tim Geithner. Michael Hershman is a very famous fellow in the areas of transparency and the issues of ethics in the firm. He has many things in his biography when you read through it, which are fascinating and fairly consistent. So some of the inconsistencies are more apparent than real, but I'll call some of them as a way to stimulate some of the thinking we may hear tonight. But he's in charge of the Fairfax Group, which was founded in 1983. Fairfax Group is a advisory group which has been active in recent years, both in Chile and also Malaysia, among other countries. I know you've been to China and elsewhere. And also advises important companies in terms of their ethical behavior. I think this is all open because you're going to talk about it tonight. This includes not only Siemens, which ran into a major problem recently, but also SNC-Lavalin, which was the largest construction company in Quebec. And of course, there's the Walmart Corporation, which we teach a few times in the course of the curriculum here at Columbia, but is part of the core class and strategy, where we discuss how they made their money, and also some of the problems around the green initiatives, as well as labor practices and labor payments. So I know people are very interested in this. But what caught my eye a little bit in looking at your biography was that you started off, and this is the language used, as a special agent with U.S. military intelligence, specializing in counter-terrorism. And then after leaving the military, you moved on to investigations of government misconduct and elsewhere. And I found that interesting in the context of the current debate around the NSA, and maybe we'll talk about these issues, et cetera. For a person who moved on to transparency, background in intelligence, which is in some ways making things more transparent, I think that's the consistency, to a world where a lot of crimes or a lot of issues of corruption are actually brought out these days through whistleblowers or people who appeal to the wider net to actually make that done. Michael worked for the FCC, one of the first chief investigator for audits and et cetera. He was awarded the Superior Honor Medal for service at the AID, and I know he had lots of activities and audits for the AID service as well. He co-founded, as I alluded to earlier, Transparency International. It's an amazing body, NGO, located in Berlin, which has worked closely with a number of international organizations, as well as been very present in universities. Recently, he's the founder in Vienna of the Anti-Corruption Academy, which we discussed before you came here, which gives out an MBA degree, and also has worked with FIFA on some of the problems in sports. You can see there's a lot of material to ask him, and I'm just looking at this and quite amazed about the things you have worked on. There's other things we can talk about, but most recently he's been involved as vice chairman of Interpol's International Group of Experts on Corruption, as well as the Financial Coalition Against Child Pornography, often in print, TV as well, well-renowned for extraordinary career, extraordinary activities. Michael, we are truly honored and pleased that you could join us today. Thank you so much. The only thing which makes me nervous every time is not to rush it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for those kind words of introduction. Let me apologize at the beginning. I have a little bit of a scratchy throat, some sort of Washington-based allergy that seems to occur every time Congress comes back into session. I don't know exactly what it is. But I'm delighted to be here to be recognized by the Sanford Bernstein Center for Leadership and Ethics, and to the family of Benjamin Botwinick. Thank you for the honor I'm receiving today. The Center for Leadership and Ethics, the three major themes of the center: corporate governance, corporate social responsibility, value-based leadership, is just as important today as it was 10 years ago when this center was founded. And I wouldn't be here today in large part if it were not for Transparency International, those in the organization who for the past 20 years, this is our 20th year anniversary as a matter of fact, have advocated around the world for good governance and transparency, accountability. I particularly want to honor those at Transparency International who have given their freedom, and in some cases their lives, by advocating for honesty in countries which fail to respect the rule of law and human rights. Let me begin today by telling you a short story about Abraham Lincoln. Before Lincoln became president, and in fact even before he became a congressman, he was a practicing attorney, having studied for the law, or read for the law as they called it back then, in the state of Illinois. This was a time of great expansion in the United States, railroads putting up tracks everywhere they could. And as it turned out, Abraham Lincoln represented a group of landowners fighting the railroads to maintain the rights to their property. Lincoln was a very effective and able trial lawyer, winning regularly in court against the railroads. One day, a young lawyer working for the railroads visited Lincoln at his law office and said that his client, the railroad owners, were very impressed with Lincoln's legal skills, his perseverance, so much so they were prepared to offer him a position as counsel for the railroads and pay him $5,000 a year, which at that time was a princely sum. Lincoln was very flattered by the offer, but declined it, saying that he'd rather stay on the side of the landowners. And he thanked him and showed him out. A week later, that same young lawyer came back and offered Lincoln $7,500. Again, Lincoln politely declined. A week later, the young lawyer came back and said, "Mr. Lincoln, my clients really would like you to come work for them, and they're prepared to offer you $10,000 to do so a year." Lincoln got up from his desk, walked around to this young lawyer, grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, took him over the window, and threw him out into the mud below. Well, thank goodness it was just a first-floor office. But the young lawyer looked up at Abraham Lincoln and said, "Mr. Lincoln, I'm sorry, did I offend you in some way?" And Lincoln said, "No, you were just getting too close to my price." So Lincoln knew, as W. Clement Stone once said, have the courage to say no. Do the right thing because it is right. These are the magic keys to living your life with integrity. Now, ethics is an easy word to define, a set of moral principles. But ethics is less easy to maintain in an era of globalization, in a society that is so complicated as ours. I remember meeting with a CEO of a large Midwestern company, and the company at that time was in a period of financial crisis. It was facing having to lay off hundreds, actually a little bit over 1,000 workers in a medium-sized town. And he called me in and he asked my advice on how he could lessen the impact of the terminations on his employees. They were all kind of family to him. And I was just beginning to explain a little bit about how it was important for him to communicate to the stakeholders, the families, the community, the vendors, in a transparent fashion, the reason behind these layoffs. Be honest, be forthright, and of course provide whatever outplacement and other services you can to ease the transition. And while I was talking to him about this, his phone rang on his desk and he picked it up. And I got up to step outside and he motioned me down and he began negotiating to buy a new car. And I forget what it was, a very fancy automobile, a Rolls Royce or a Bentley. And I thought to myself, now, ordering a new car, of course, is not improper. And it's not illegal. If it were illegal, I'd probably be speaking to you now on Skype from some federal penitentiary. But what sort of message was that sending? From a standpoint of corporate responsibility, I wondered how the soon-departed employees would react to seeing this guy riding around town in a new expensive automobile while they were down at the unemployment office. So it's always important to remember that ethics and morality is more about deeds than about words. We all talk these days about tone from the top. It's become a household word. Every corporate leader will tell you what's right and what's wrong. But what's more important is to look at what he's doing rather than what he's saying. Anyone could write a speech about good morals, good ethics, how we're going to be a model for compliance and good governance in the world today. But people in his employ, the stakeholders in the company, investors and others, look to that person for responsible behavior beyond the words that he or she is saying. And there will come a time in the near future when each of you will hear some of the most beautiful words in the English language, and perhaps you've already heard these. You now have this job. I'm offering you this job. You'll begin a new career, and early on may face difficult decisions brought on by pressures to succeed in a very competitive marketplace. You may find yourself in a position where you're asked to do something that doesn't seem quite right, that doesn't pass the smell test, which leaves you feeling slightly uncomfortable. Now, I know that most of you have been through some sort of ethics training here at the center or elsewhere, and I hope that these teachings will guide you in your future decisions, particularly when you're faced with a difficult ethical decision. But what will you do when faced with a real-world problem, not a case study? I mean, what would you do if your CEO or supervisor, the person who holds power to hire and fire, to promote, to give bonuses, asks you to do something which is inappropriate or possibly illegal? What would you do? If, for example, you were employed in the mortgage industry, you might be asked to evaluate and approve a loan where the applicant is clearly not qualified. Of course, in light of the recent subprime mortgage scandal, this scenario is less likely to happen today. Or is it? If you choose to work in international sales or business development, you might be asked to provide an expensive gift to a foreign official who's about to make a decision about letting a contract to your company. Of course, in light of recent prosecutions for violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, this is less likely to happen today. Or is it? You might be employed in a company and asked to book a public company and asked to book third quarter sales which have not been closed yet. Could something like this still be going on in light of recent SEC investigations? Or even you could be asked to make a political donation by your boss and told that the company will reimburse you for this. All you have to do is submit an expense voucher showing that you spent the money on something else. My point is that still today, business leaders are obsessed by the need, some business leaders are obsessed by the need to meet financial expectations, to maximize shareholder value. And this often creates a setting in which ethical or legal lines are pushed beyond the limits of what's right. The examples of misconduct which I'm just cited still happen today, even in some of the most well-respected companies. GlaxoSmithKline is currently under investigation in China for bribery. The now detained former Glaxo China manager for some years has stated that the bribery was coordinated at the highest levels of the company and that employees were given sales growth targets which were impossible to meet without resorting to corrupt behavior. Recently, I read an article in the Washington Post, "The Lesson of Lehman We Didn't Learn." Now, Lehman Brothers, you may recall, in 2008 failed, setting off a chain reaction that came close to melting the world's financial system. The article focused on the Federal Reserve Bank's intervention and the weakening of the Fed's ability to respond to similar problems in the future. It got me to thinking, however, about more current problems and scandals in the financial community and how apparently some past lessons have not really been learned. And this is not about ongoing lawsuits against companies like Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, Barclays, for their past involvement in selling mortgage-backed securities in the 2006-2007 timeframe. I'm referring to recent disclosures that J.P. Morgan, Chase, Citibank, and other financial institutions will have to pay billions of dollars to resolve claims of widespread foreclosure, abuse, and fraud. It's alleged that mortgage handlers illegally seized homes of homeowners in improperly accelerated foreclosures by failing to amass required paperwork and in some cases lying to local judges. So these foreclosures were mostly accrued during the subprime era, the loan scandal era. How about, talk about adding insult to injury. Pick up any newspaper today and you'll readily see that violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act continue to be exposed on a regular basis. In 2007, an investigation was started into business practices by Siemens, one of the largest multinationals in the world, very prominent company. And after several years of internal and external investigations, it was found that Siemens had paid over the course of 10 years approximately $1.8 billion in bribes to foreign officials in about a dozen or more countries. And these bribes took many different forms: cash payments, gifts, travel, educational expenses for their children. It reminds me that in 1999, when Siemens was first listed on the New York Stock Exchange, thereby subjecting it to SEC oversight and, of course, to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, I was called by them and asked to travel to their corporate headquarters in Germany, in Erlangen at that time, and to give a lecture on corporate responsibility. Now that they're a public company, what must they be concerned about? What must they do differently? And I spoke for about 90 minutes or so on the changing global regulatory environment, and in particular about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and what dangers lay ahead for them in terms of their doing business in high-risk countries. And at the conclusion of my lecture, I asked for questions. There were about 30 top executives, and I was greeted by complete silence. And, I thought to myself, this is odd. But then again, the lecture was kind of technical, boring, so I kind of let it slide. Well, fast forward to 2006, in December 2006, I was called back to Siemens, this time in Munich, to meet privately with their top leadership. The company was in the midst of a huge scandal. Newspapers were parked at their door and reporting on a daily basis about Siemens engaged in bribery overseas, keeping slush funds. Just prior to my arrival to talk to them about this, they were raided by German law enforcement. They seized tens of thousands of documents, files, computer hard drives, disks. And the newspapers were reporting that it seemed that the allegations of corruption were widespread. So one of the executives I was meeting with was the chairman of the supervisory board, Heinrich von Pira, who had been the CEO of Siemens for many, many years and was just recently, in the last year or two, promoted to the chair of the supervisory board. He said to me, Siemens would never condone any of this conduct, that it had to be a result of rogue employees who were not following corporate guidelines and standards. He went on to say that Siemens had a very robust compliance program and governance program, which included 513 compliance officers stationed around the world, there to help enforce the compliance program. They asked if I would come in as the independent compliance advisor to the board and to take a look what happened, to report back to them on what went wrong and what can be improved to help avoid a repeat of this in the future. And of course, I was concerned about that because of my affiliation with Transparency International, which is not a commercial affiliation, it's a voluntary affiliation. I wanted to be very careful about not getting into a situation that might embarrass Transparency International. So I said to them, I said, look, if I come on board, you have to know something. I'm going to ferret out the truth. I'm going to find out what went wrong, and the truth will be known to your stakeholders and will become known to the public. If you don't want that, don't hire me, because if I'm halfway through my assignment and I'm not getting the cooperation I need, I'm going to leave. It's going to make things worse for you. It's not going to look good at all. So they agreed to those conditions. They gave me the assurances, and one of the first things, of course, I immediately I took a look at their written compliance program. Of course, they had one, just like Exxon had a crisis management plan before the Exxon Valdez disaster, but that was sitting on some shelf gathering dust, and I suspect the compliance plan was somewhat dusty in Siemens as well. So I decided at the very beginning to send 17 teams of auditors and investigators to the high-risk corruption countries around the world where Siemens had offices. At that time, they had 400,000 employees, and they did business in, I guess, 180 countries. But I chose randomly 17 countries that I knew were hard to do business in without violating the law. And we had a list of all these 513 compliance offices around the world. And when we went into the office in Indonesia or in India, the first thing we did is we said, look, we want to look at your financial controls and systems, and we want to talk to the compliance officer. Almost in every case, the compliance officer would say, I didn't know I was a compliance officer. Or, what is a compliance officer? Well, it didn't take us long to figure out that the corruption in Siemens was systematic, sanctioned, and well-funded. And Siemens went on to pay enormous civil fines. A number of their people went to prison. But they did reform. And in fact, they've reformed to the point where they have become now a model for others in their industry, in their sector. Or I should say sectors, because they're in quite a number of different businesses. But I still remember going back to that time in 1999 when I stood in front of those 30-so executives, many of whom went on to go to jail or were terminated from the country, and asked for questions, and no one spoke up. No pressure, but at the conclusion of my lecture tonight, when I ask for questions, you might want to take that into consideration. But you would have thought, because of the notoriety of Siemens, what happened to Siemens, and Siemens, given the fines they paid and the legal fees and accounting fees, it cost the company about $3 billion. Not every company, obviously, could survive paying that kind of money. But the cost and reputation was far more damaging than that. They had an external monitor brought in to oversee their compliance and governance program for 3 years, to report back to the Justice Department, to the SEC. So you would have thought that the notoriety, that the damage caused from the Siemens scandal would have taught others a lesson. However, here comes Walmart, who recently disclosed that they're investigating alleged violations of Fcpa laws, both in Mexico and China and elsewhere, and whether prior allegations of such violations were ignored by top-level executives. So far, the company has spent over about 6 months $250 million investigating these allegations, which include having paid $28 million to Mexican government officials to win approvals for new stores. Other cases of recent corporate misconduct include the chairman of Galen Capital Corporation, who in 2007 recruited corporate employees to serve as straw donors to federal political candidates. And then, using Galen Capital money, he authorized the reimbursement of these employees, and thereby violating federal campaign laws. And now, notwithstanding that case in 2007, we're watching in Quebec the Charbonnet Commission hold hearings on corruption and ties between organized crime and business and politics in Quebec. And it's disclosed that one of their largest corporations, Dassault Corporation, had indeed, along with other major Canadian firms, been ordering employees to make contributions out of their own personal pocket to support candidates in Quebec, and then submit expense vouchers, phony expense vouchers, to get reimbursed. So there may come a time, even today, when you're faced with a decision to do something unethical, immoral, or illegal to advance the objectives of your company or to advance your own career. And the question I have is, will you have the courage to say no? Of course, there are many different ways of saying no. I would strongly recommend you not using the direct approach, you know, the kind where you put a four-letter word in front of no. I don't know what you were thinking about. I was talking about the word hell, like in hell no. The more diplomatic approach would be to inquire as to whether this conduct might pass the New York Times test. If the conduct became known and ended up on the front page of the New York Times, how would it look? Of course, saying no regardless of how you say it is likely to put you at some risk of job loss or promotion denied or bonus denied. On the other hand, engaging in inappropriate conduct will also put you at risk. You could risk your entire future, your freedom, your reputation, your family, your friends. So when faced with difficult choices, when your reputation is at stake, don't concentrate on career advancement. That's not the time to do it. Integrity is more important, and it ultimately matters most, and carries with it, by the way, its own sets of rewards. Always remember, you have to live with the results of your decisions and actions, and those will impact your future, including your ability to get a good night's sleep. So how did we evolve to where we are today? I mean, recent surveys consistently report public's perception and trust in corporations are now all-time low. I mean, the good news is that the reputation of Congress is judged as being far worse. And by the way, I should point out, talking about Congress, that the inappropriate behavior I've cited in the business world exists in the government world and the political world as well. So those of you who have your sights set on public service, which I encourage you to do, have also got to be very wary about falling into the trap where you violate standards. One conclusion is clear to me. We find ourselves in this ethical kind of wasteland today, not because of lack of appropriate laws or regulations. Rather, it's due to a general decline in ethical values. Too many people around the world have come to think that obtaining wealth and status, that material or personal gain, is more important than preserving high ethical standards, than doing the right thing. They believe that cutting corners, big or small, is okay, that the end justifies the means. Remember the unrestrained corporate raiders of past years. Simply put, they bought companies, stripped them of assets, fired thousands of employees, and emphasized maximizing their return, even if customer service, product quality, or the long-term survivability of the corporation was endangered. And that atmosphere back then, in large part, led to a schism between the very successful in business and the middle class in this country that still reverberates today. The drive to accumulate virtually unlimited wealth trumped all else back then, including common sense and, in my judgment, common decency. But please don't understand me. I mean, I'm a great believer in the free enterprise system. I'm an entrepreneur. I've had a company for 30 years. I've bought companies. I've sold companies. But I do believe that ethical leadership and corporate social responsibility is always important, not just when convenient or when caught, and that a good value system can be a strong driver for enhancing corporate profits. Having a strong set of ethical standards has proven not only to increase earnings and enhance equity, but it is shown that companies which have robust governance and compliance programs are far more respected by their customers, who clearly favor buying products and services from honest companies. My experience with those on an individual basis that have followed the wrong path, because I have served in law enforcement, and I have, in my younger years, actually found myself putting handcuffs on people who were corrupt police officers, in some cases judges. And my experience with those who follow the wrong path by looking for shortcuts and methods to circumvent the rules, they wind up very unhappy and unsatisfied in life. Many turn to destructive behavior, including alcohol and drugs, have a history of failed relationships. I mean, losing their freedom and their material wealth may be public measures of their problems, but their private failures are often much more significant. I can assure you this, though, if you follow a course of high principles, you may sometimes feel like the Lone Ranger, but ultimately you will be happier, more respected, and at peace with yourself. And also, please don't ever think of corruption as a victimless crime. I have seen and spoken to those in less developed countries who suffer from hunger, from disease, lack of education, lack of opportunity, much of it due to corruption. People lose their dignity in their lives, while so much wealth is diverted to a few corrupt leaders. Let's not forget, just recently, over 1,100 Bangladeshis died in a building collapse that we now know was because of substandard construction. Ask yourself where the building inspectors were and how much they pocketed to overlook those construction violations. And not long ago, I had an opportunity to visit with a former senior minister of an African government who had been thrown from office because of corruption and is now charged with those crimes. I asked him why he'd taken bribes, and he said, because I had a responsibility to the poor people of my tribe, and I had to take money to help them. I glanced down at a report I had in front of me, which listed some of his extensive holdings, including 2 multi-million-dollar mansions in Europe, a yacht, a bevy of exclusive cars, all outside the country, and wondered how many of his poor tribesmen, fellow tribesmen, he allowed to use them or benefit from them. So let me say in conclusion, let me give you a quote from H. Jackson Brown Jr., who said, "Live so that when your children think of fairness and integrity, they think of you." Thank you very much. And now I'd be delighted to take questions. Yes, sir.
Thanks a lot for this very inspiring speech and the students here at the moment. I was wondering whether you could elaborate perhaps a little bit on Transparency International and the challenges you see it facing right now.
Yeah. So, look, a very small group of people, myself, Peter Eigen, and 1 or 2 other folks, began meeting in 1990. We all had experience in corruption and development. We had all, I worked for the Agency for International Development, Peter worked for the World Bank, Kamal Hussein, one of my other colleagues, had been the foreign minister and former Attorney General of Bangladesh. And we began meeting in 1990 and saying, we've got to do something about corruption. No one wants to talk about it in the World Bank. You couldn't use the terms bribery or corruption. If you wanted to talk about issues like that, you'd have to talk about good governance. But, you know, we didn't have much in the way of resources, and certainly not much in the way of knowledge about what we could do, but we kind of felt like we wanted to create something that would be like an Amnesty International, but instead of dealing with human rights issues, maybe dealing with corruption. So we met from time to time. We all had busy lives, but if we managed to wind up close to one another in the same country and city, we'd meet and continue our conversations for about 3 years. And finally, we decided to start an NGO. I mean, we debated whether we should make it an international organization, an corporation, an NGO. We came to the conclusion an NGO. Then we debated what should we call it. Should we call it Honesty International or Integrity International? And Peter came up with Transparency International. This is 1993. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a second, transparency is like a little slide. Because back then, nowadays transparency also is a household word and everyone knows what it means. But back then, it really wasn't a common term in the United States. It was a lot more common in Europe. So I argued against it, wanting to call it Honesty International. But I lost, and I'm glad I did. I lost that argument. So here we founded this NGO. We had no money, no staff, nothing. Just an idea that we wanted to get people to talk about the subject, to bring it out of the closet. And the core value of transparency, we decided, would be not to investigate corruption, but to bring together the business community, the civil society, to bring together government, to talk about ways to solve corruption. We were lucky enough to get a small grant for something called the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Zusammenarbeit, which is the equivalent of AID. It's the Technical Assistance Organization. And the first thing we did, following their advice, is we wrote a book, Best Practices. And the book became an overnight sensation, nothing you'd find on the New York Times bestsellers list. In government circles, in certain civil society circles, the World Bank published the book in 12 different languages, and it set a course for us for the coming years. We're headquartered in Berlin. We have 100 chapters in countries around the world. We're an advocacy group. We fight hard for laws to combat corruption. We provide technical assistance to civil society, to governments, to business on how to reform and how to govern their organizations. And it's just kind of one of these, over the years, I've actually got involved with a lot of sort of do-gooder things that never went anywhere. And I'm still continually amazed that this Transparency International has become as successful as it has been. And a lot of it has to do with the Corruption Perception Index, which we began publishing 17 years ago. And it is a perception index because there's no scientific way of comparing whether the UK is more corrupt than Germany or the United States is more corrupt than Sweden. So we do these surveys and use existing surveys as well of businessmen and academics and government employees in various countries, and we do this, have an independent organization do these surveys. We come up with a list, and I have to tell you, although it's not scientific, when you see out of the 164 countries that Iraq or Nigeria is near the bottom, that is the worst in corruption, no one really argues, well, Nigeria should be really 163 instead of 162, or Iraq should be 165 rather than 164. We're pretty close to being accurate on where these countries are. Our country, by the way, has been declining on the list. Number one is, for some reason, it always seems to be New Zealand. Probably because no one cares much about New Zealand. I don't know. I mean, it doesn't have much trade, but in any event, and I don't knock New Zealand, there's no country that's without corruption. But we, since the financial crisis, in this the mortgage crisis that I alluded to earlier, our ranking has continually fallen. So again, that comes from the perception. In this country, we have a terrible corruption problem, but we deal with it. When we find it, we prosecute it. In other countries, it's not always like that. So we're down to, I think we're about number 18 on the list right now. Any other questions? Yes.
Well, just to add to that, so when Jim Wolfenson was president of the World Bank, he had an enormous influence. The World Bank began because of him to speak about corruption. But he had a huge fight at the World Bank. The lawyer for the bank said, you can't mention the C word, we don't do it, it's political. And he just said, of course we can't have development without transparency. But part of what happened as a consequence is governments came to him and said, how do we get rid of corruption? And all our children have ever seen is corruption. And what work has Transparency International done with actual countries who have only had corrupt governments modeled? How do you change that?
It takes many, many years to change a culture of corruption in a country. Jim recognized that. Jim was truly a visionary when it came to governance in the World Bank. He was the first one that began to institute programs to address the issue of corruption. I'll never forget that I gave a speech not long after Transparency International was founded. So it might have been, let's say, 1995 or 6. I was asked to come speak on a panel at the United Nations on this subject, and on the panel was the General Counsel of the World Bank, a guy by the name of Shihada. Yes.
And he's the one who told you he can't.
Well, it's interesting. I gave my speech about this new organization, Transparency International, and what we aimed on doing. And Shihada then said, spoke right after me on this panel and said, the World Bank will never support this nonsense. This organization doesn't have a chance of surviving. We are attacking an essential element in these countries of corruption, impunity. What we're trying to do is make it far more difficult for the corrupt officials to hide their money, to use their money. We've been very successful with Transparency International in getting laws concerning corruption standardized around the world. 1977 was the enactment of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We were the only country to outlaw bribing foreign officials for 20 years until the passage of the OECD Anti-Corruption Treaty. Following that, we had the International Inter-American Treaty Against Corruption. We have the UN Convention Against Corruption. We have the European Council Civil and Criminal Law Conventions Against Corruption. We have a number of other regional and local laws against corruption. We've got to fight corruption in these countries and attack it in 3 or 4 different ways. Ending impunity. Make it so people can't hide their assets and use their assets. 2, education. Someone from Mexico asked me how Mexico was doing in its drive against corruption. I was down there recently. And I said that I will be satisfied that Mexico has really changed when you are driving he had a 7-year-old son. So when you're driving your 7-year-old son to the grocery store and are stopped by that motorcycle cop, not because you did anything wrong, but he wants his hand out. And when he comes to the window and you give him that money, when your son says, Dad, that's not right, you shouldn't have done that. It's this next generation that we have to concentrate on. We have to educate at the primary level more on values, more on ethics in many of these countries, our own country as well. I mean, we all were taught when we sat at the breakfast table or dinner table at night, it's wrong to lie, cheat, and steal. But when your kids start going to school, they get different messages from their peers and elsewhere. So the training and education, it's important to have it at home, but it's got to be inculcated into our education system as well. You have to have strong local enforcement, independent anti-corruption agencies. You have to have the international business community come together to say no. And you have to have the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the European Reconstruction Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, African Development Bank, Asia Development. They have got to say, no, you're not going to get this loan, you're not going to get this money, unless you can show to us it's going to be used for the right purpose. I can't tell you how many times when I was with AID and I was in charge of our audit and investigation security program, when I went out to a remote site in some god-awful poor country and looked at where we spent $10 million to build a hospital, and there wasn't anything there, and the money was gone. And it happens today every single day. And particularly vulnerable is when there's a big disaster and billions of dollars, or whether it be Haiti or elsewhere, are thrown into these poor countries after disaster, with no systems and controls to ensure the money is actually used for the purpose it's intended for. We'll come back to you next.
Amarpreet Nanda, Morgan Stanley. The question is, let me frame it a different way, but the question is around, you hire the smartest and the brightest. So when I hire people for my staff, you hire the smartest and the brightest. You pride yourself, look, the team I have built. Something goes wrong, right? Over a period of time, something goes wrong in corporate environment, because when you pick up the papers and you read about big banks, they don't hire frauds. The evaluation system at the point of entry is always focused around hiring people with good values, hiring people who are the smartest in their career paths, etc. How do you detect along the course of someone's development as to if those values are still intact? What are the tests you will give? Because when it comes around talking about promotions, you talk about the best project, you talk about the best earners, you don't talk about did they pass the ethics test? So is there a benchmark? Is there a tool someone could use and say, over a period of someone's career, let me try this couple of times and see?
Well, I appreciate that question. It's a very good question. I mean, you know, I remember once sitting in office at GE corporate headquarters, and Jack Welch was having a meeting of his senior direct reports. Now, Jack was a pretty tough guy. He had really high standards, and he had firm objectives in terms of financial performance. But I remember him saying, look, if you don't meet your numbers, because you had to walk away from a deal that might have crossed the line, that might have brought loss of reputation to this company, I'll understand that. And he pretty well conducted himself in that way, his own business life. So I don't think you can predict when you're hiring someone whether that someone is going to be good or bad. You're taking them into a culture that they will adapt to. And there's no company of any size that is going to, at some point in the future, a company of any size is going to have something go wrong. An employee is going to go off the reservation. But what you don't want is, you don't want it to be shown that it was systematic. You want to be shown that all of your checks and balances, your systems and controls, your ethics guidelines, your ethics training programs were all in place and working. And the damage will be strictly limited if you do that. But there's no way to predict good behavior and bad behavior. It's all up to the culture that the leadership establishes in the corporation. And when a corporate, and I've seen this, you know, when a corporate executive gets up at town hall meetings within his company and talks about morality and ethics, and then gets in his private jet and jets off with his mistress for a short vacation in the Bahamas and doesn't think anyone notices that, again, it's not words, but deeds. And you can't give, if someone does step off the reservation, the reaction has got to be quick and swift and unforgiving. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering if towards the more extreme end of dysfunctional countries, I think corruption is not always confined to a couple of dictators or a couple of high-level officials, but it kind of cuts across all the levels of society, right? And it may actually take the place of a well-functioning taxation system or a way of delivering salaries to your civil servants. Now, in such countries, a company may argue that it's either it has to go along with that, or it can just not do business there and not create employment and value in that country. So, or maybe because for fear of corruption. What would you tell such? What are the ethics of this?
Well, again, a very good point. Look, there's many different types of corruption. There's the corruption I've been speaking with or dealing with primarily in this session. I really describe as grand corruption, but there's much more petty corruption that goes on in many countries, having to pay to get a telephone or a driver's license. And these countries, by the way, where these payments are routine, often have rules that over-regulate the issuance of licenses and other requirements. And I've heard many people say, look, a civil servant can't survive on his salary without taking bribes, and there's nothing wrong with that. But remember that you always have a choice of where you're going to work or where you want to work and how you're going to conduct yourself in that employment. When I worked on police corruption here in New York, frankly long before you were born, I hate to date myself, but I think I just did. I worked on cases like the Serpico case, which you probably never heard of it, but it was turned into a movie. I found that the cops who started taking that free cup of coffee from the neighborhood grocer and then would let him double park in front of the store, I saw how that continually broke down the system of ethics and led to increasingly more corrupt behavior, not on everyone's part, but on many of the part of the people that started small wound up taking big. And so, I'm of the mind that we have to have a zero tolerance for corruption, even though I know that I was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo 2 years ago. I was there, the State Department sent me to speak to the president, Kabila, because they thought maybe because of my background in Transparency International, I might have greater influence there than someone coming from the government. And I went over there and I met first with many of his ministers and senior officers, and I will never forget, I met with the Chief of Staff of the Army, and I said to him, how many soldiers do you have here? He said, I don't know. I said, well, can you have an estimate? He said, we have maybe about 100,000. I said, well, how is it that you don't know? He said, well, you have to understand, we never kept personnel records. We have no files. And we're just putting in a system now the French has given us software to be able to have a system, a personnel system, management system to see how many soldiers we have. And he said, in fact, I just got the first printout. And I asked to see it, and I was going through it, and I said, there's something wrong. There's a glitch in your software system. Of course, I noticed that the age of some of these soldiers is he's 98. And here's another guy who's 94 and 96. He says, well, you don't understand. We don't have a retirement system here. So they just stay on until they die. And I said, well, how do they get paid? They get paid in cash. And I said, why in cash? Well, we don't have banks in the bush, in the jungle. We don't have banks. And he said, but what happens is we give the cash to the general, and he takes his cut, and we give it then to he gives it to the colonel, he takes his cut, then he gives it to the major, who takes his cut, the captain, lieutenant, sergeant, on down, to when it gets down to the poor soldier, no wonder they're out raping and pillaging. There's nothing left for them. So I understand the dilemma and conflict, but it doesn't have to be like that. I mean, they could pay them. I said, look, why don't you set up commissaries, government-owned commissaries, and pay them in goods and services, for their services. So, I always believe that there is a way around the petty corruption by lessening regulations, by increasing where it's possible civil servants' pay, giving incentives for honest behavior. I've been working with the government of Malaysia to do just that for the past 3 years in the government transformation program, and it's worked out pretty well so far.
Michael, I started doing international business in the 1960s, and payoffs were the way that business was done in most of the world in those days. And things have cleaned up somewhat. A lot of it changed after the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was put in the U.S. But I had a very successful high-tech company that I had started. We did half our business internationally. We were one of the fastest growing companies on the New York Stock Exchange for years. And we were very clean. Even though we were dealing principally or largely with government telecommunications authorities, which were notorious for looking for payoffs, we countered that by having the best equipment and leading the industry by a lot. I sold the company to a Fortune 50 company in a related business. I don't want to name the company. And the philosophy was that our salespeople were going to get entree to places that they couldn't get in at a high enough level because of the entree of this bigger company. And when my salespeople started reporting back to me, they said, these guys are paying off everybody. And it wasn't cash. They rent a car for them for a year, and they give them plane tickets, charge it, to company travels. And he says, but everybody's getting paid off. So, they knew that I wouldn't tolerate it. And I brought it up at a management committee meeting of the senior company. And I was running about a third of the company at the time. And I said, I can't do business this way. And I won't do business this way. And they said, if you don't, you're never going to sell anything in the markets that we're in. And that was shortly before I tendered my resignation. I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know that I could deal with it.
Well, in 1977, when the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was being considered under the Carter administration, every major multinational in the United States was pounding on the door of Congress saying, you're going to put us out of business. If we're the only companies
yes.
that we can't bribe overseas, we'll never get any contracts.
Right.
Well, that didn't happen, actually. If you look at and the Commerce Department prints a report on an annual basis of the growth of international business, you'll notice that companies were able to adapt. I mean, companies that provide good products at good prices and do it honestly have survived and grown overseas, even in difficult environments. Does that mean they win every contract? No, not at all. There are still countries that, frankly, the most ethical companies won't do business in certain countries because they know they can't do business there without risking violating the law. But good Lord, look what's happening in China right now. Who would have ever imagined? They began on an anti-corruption campaign just before they held the Olympics. And everyone said, I wonder if this is just show for the Olympics and what's going to happen. It's like they removed all the dogs and the pet beggars from some of the districts, for show during the Olympics. So people were thinking, is this anti-corruption drive going to sort of be the same thing? But look what they're doing now. I mean, now they've expanded their anti-corruption efforts, and they're focusing on multinational corporations, and also Chinese companies who were doing business outside of China. I never would have guessed that. At the same time, I can't in good conscience tell a company to go in and spend a lot of money trying to do business in Russia, because I don't think they can do it in Russia right now without making payments. And I certainly don't think you can do it in a country like Iraq. So stay out of it until things change. You know, I tell you, I hate to tell war stories all the time, but so my company has a security group. I cut my teeth on counterterrorism, and so we bid on a contract for, actually it was an IT-related security contract for the Greek Olympics, the Athens Olympic Organizing Committee, right? Multi-million-dollar contract. And like everything else in Greece, it took forever. I mean, I'd never thought that this Olympics was going to take place because nothing was happening. So I get a call, Mr. Hershman, we've got good news from you, from someone from the Olympic Organizing Committee. You've won the contract. Can you come 3 days from now and we're going to do this announcement? I said, I'm happy to do it. I went over there with a guy who ran my office in Boston, the Fairfax Group office in Boston, who was a Greek American, spoke the language. We got in the hotel, and we were called just the night before the award was to be announced by a media company, public relations company, saying, look, we work with the Athens Olympic Organizing Committee. Can you come over first thing tomorrow morning so we can discuss how this is going to be done, the announcement? This is odd. This is, this is like it's a couple $1 million contract for me. It was a big contract, but this is a multi-billion-dollar effort. And so we go over there, and they said, congratulations, later this afternoon, it's going to be announced that you awarded this IT security contract. And of course, you have to pay us 5%. I said, what are you talking about, 5%? They said, well, the standard here, you've got to pay us 5% of the total contract amount. I said, for what? Well, that's what the leadership of the organizing committee, that's what they require. I said, are you out of your mind? You know you're talking to the guy who founded Transparency International? He said, yes, I understand that, sir, but that's how business is done here. Well, I don't do business like that. And I got on the next plane and I left. And I went back and I saw my friend at the time was head of the Foreign Corrupt Practices section of the Justice Department. And I called him, I said, you're not going to believe what just happened. And he got furious, and he called the United States ambassador. And the United States ambassador called one of the ministers in the Greek government. And the next thing you know, I get a phone call saying, it was a big misunderstanding. Please come back. So, there are ways, if you know the right avenues to, even in countries where corruption is endemic, and Greece was one of them, where you can straighten things out. But you really have to know this is not a game for a new business. You really have to know the ins and outs of bringing pressure on the government.
And you have to be willing to walk away.
You have to be willing to walk away. Yeah.
Question for you. Actually, it's a choice of two. But one is probably more theoretical. It has to do with the NSA issues and whistleblowers and that alternative. Actually, I'd rather ask you something else. You started off talking about Lehman Brothers and finance industry in general. The New York Times has been having a series of articles recently kind of saying how very few people have been charged and talking about various people. It's not clear that Lehman did anything criminally wrong. And I've always felt maybe it was hard for the finance industry because they had a choice between looking a little bit, seedy or looking a little bit stupid. And since their finance would never want to look stupid, they kind of ended up looking a little seeding on the whole thing. But did they actually do things which you would find to be unethical? And how would you say they actually were?
Yes, I do believe that, again, let me go back to the subprime. This is really what kicked this whole thing off. So here's what happened. It was like a pyramid. You had the guy at the bottom who was processing mortgages, okay? And his job was to process as many mortgages as possible for the guy he worked for, who was a mortgage broker. And they didn't care how accurate the information was. They were supposed to check it. I mean, there's a criminal law saying if you lie on a mortgage application, you violated the law. It's a criminal statute. I don't know anyone that's ever gone to jail. Well, actually now there's a few people, but before the 2006-7 time frame, no one ever went to jail for that. So the real estate agents would be, in some cases, giving a bribe to the brokers to get the mortgages through, because they couldn't get them through if they didn't rubber stamp them. The banks knew this. This was an open secret. The system was totally corrupted, and everyone knew it from the bottom to the top. The people that were bringing the mortgages together, I'm sorry? Exactly. They knew what was going on down low. It's a pyramid scheme, and it was totally corrupt and totally unethical. And, frankly, I think it's odd that some more people haven't gone to jail. And some of the people referred to were both seedy and stupid. I don't know how they avoided jail, actually.
Any final questions? This is your chance. You also have opportunity to speak directly.
So how come no one has asked me whether I was ever, someone ever offered me a bribe? Usually every one of these sessions, someone says, "You've ever been offered a bribe?"
Tell us about the great story.
It's
No, that they wanted me to pay the bribe in that story.
It's unimaginable with your background and presentation that anybody would dare.
I was offered a bribe. Believe it or not, I was. So the finance minister of the government of India, a guy by the name of VP Singh, called me one day. Actually, he didn't call me. He is the head of the criminal investigation division of the finance ministry. And he calls me and says, "Mr. Hershman, we have been doing, and this was under the government of Rajiv Gandhi, we have been doing a major investigation of currency control law violations here in India. And we're stuck. We've been able to figure out who's taking the money out of the country illegally, businessmen, very wealthy businessmen. But we can't find where the money's going overseas. So would you come and meet with us and see if you can help us?" So I flew over there, and I met with him and VP Singh, and they said, "We'd like to retain your firm to help us do this investigation, because we simply don't have the expertise outside the country that you guys do." So I said, "Fine, I'm happy to do that." We entered into an agreement, and we began, and within 2 months, I found this bank account in Switzerland that had an odd name. Mont Blanc was the name on the bank account. And there was a lot of money in it, like almost $1 billion in it. But when I started digging further, I found it had nothing to do with currency control law violations. It represented bribes for the purchase of arms by the defense ministry and high-level people in the Gandhi administration. It got to kind of been known as the Bofors case, the Swedish arms dealer case. So I went back to VP Singh. I said, look, this is not my task here, but I think you should know. He said, "No, I want you to follow this through." Well, word got back to Rajiv Gandhi that this was now under investigation, and he made a big deal of it. He went on the floor of the Parliament, and he called a special session of Parliament, and he said, "This is outrageous. A company named the Fairfax Group has been hired to investigate the internal workings of my government, and this is a CIA front company that is been hired to destabilize my government." Of course, I didn't know this until I got a call from a reporter from the New York Times the next day, and he said, "Did you hear what Rajiv Gandhi said?" I said, "No, what did he say?" He said, told me what he said. I said, Of course, me being from Brooklyn, I sometimes speak before I think. So I said, look, he doesn't need us to help to stabilize his government. He's doing a fine job of it himself. Which also didn't go over too well. So then he one-upped me, and he formed the Supreme Court Commission, Dakar Commission, to investigate the circumstances surrounding Fairfax Group being hired. And VP Singh was a very senior minister of finance in his Congress party, couldn't fire him. He took him and he said, you know, I'm changing you. You're not going to become the defense minister. So I called VP Singh. I said, look, you essentially no longer finance minister. What do you want me to do? And he said, keep on investigating. Now I'm the defense minister. I can get into all these files of the Beaufort scandal. So I found that some of the money was going to this bank that became somewhat notorious, called BCCI in London. It was a Pakistani-owned bank. And I was in London, and I developed a source in the bank. And 3 o'clock in the morning one morning, I get a knock on my hotel. I was in the Hilton Hotel in London, knock on the door. I look at the people, and I see like the bottom of a beard. So I'm 6 foot tall. This has got to be one tall guy. 3 o'clock in the morning. I said, what do you want? He said, well, Mr. Hershman, it's imperative I speak to you. I must talk to you immediately. I said, well, what about it? You know, go call my office, make an appointment. He said, no. I said, all right, go downstairs and call me on the house phone. So he calls up. He said, Mr. Hershman, you've got to stop this investigation. We're prepared to offer you $1 million cash. This was in the 80s, a lot of money back then. If you stop your investigation. I said, well, and if I don't? He said, well, then we're going to cut you up in little pieces and throw you in the Thames. So I decided to change hotels the next day. But to make a long story short, it became known as Fairfax Gate in India. It resulted in the in Rajiv Gandhi's loss. VP Singh quit the defense ministry and ran against him for prime minister and won. And of course, Rajiv Gandhi, not long after that, was assassinated. But he didn't meet my price, as they didn't meet Lincoln's price when they came to offer him a job working for the railroads. Thank you all very much.